They called him crazy. Not because he was dangerous, but because no one could understand how a quiet farmer from the English countryside could possibly change the course of the biggest invasion in human history. In 1943, while Europe burned and armies clashed across continents, one man worked alone in a muddy field surrounded not by soldiers, but by sheep and rusted tools. His neighbors saw a recluse. The British military would soon see a miracle. This is the story of the crazy farmer who built the weapon that changed D-Day forever. It begins not in a factory or a laboratory, but on a small farm in Lincolnshire, a place where the wind never seemed to rest, and the nights carried the distant hum of war. Britain was preparing for something enormous, an operation so secret even most generals didn't know the full plan. Its code name, Operation Overlord. The Allied forces needed to land on the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. But there was one massive problem. How do you invade a fortress built of steel and concrete, guarded by millions of mines, anti-tank obstacles, and endless artillery? The German Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to Spain, a death trap built for one purpose, to crush any invasion before it began. And that's where our farmer enters the story. His name was Donald Bailey. Before the war, he wasn't a soldier or an engineer. He was just a man who loved solving problems, a tinkerer, a dreamer. His obsession was bridges. He spent hours sketching designs in his barn, trying to build lightweight structures that could be assembled quickly, even with limited tools. To his friends, it was a harmless hobby. To his neighbors, it was nonsense, a farmer wasting time on childish ideas while bombs fell on London. But to history, it would become one of the most important inventions of the Second World War. When the war broke out, Bailey enlisted in the Royal Engineers. But unlike most soldiers, he didn't fight with guns. He fought with imagination. The British Army had a desperate need for portable bridges, something strong enough for tanks, light enough for transport, and simple enough for soldiers to assemble under fire. Bailey started experimenting with scrap metal and wood, testing different patterns and supports. What he discovered was revolutionary. By using a system of prefabricated panels that could be bolted together, he could create a bridge in hours instead of weeks. He called it the Bailey Bridge. The military called it a miracle. But before that miracle was proven, it was almost dismissed, because no one could believe a farmer's idea could stand up to the weight of a 40-ton tank. In late 1941, Bailey was ordered to demonstrate his bridge to a group of skeptical officers. The task took place at a small training ground near London. The officers stood with arms crossed, unimpressed, as Bailey and a few engineers assembled his strange-looking contraption. When the first tank rumbled onto it, the bridge shuddered and the officers smirked. But as the tank reached the middle and the bridge held firm, their smiles faded. When the second tank followed and the structure didn't bend an inch, their silence turned to awe. By the end of the test, everyone knew what they had witnessed, the birth of a new kind of warfare. The Bailey Bridge became the secret weapon of mobility, a tool that could keep armies moving no matter how many bridges the enemy destroyed. Across North Africa, Italy, and Burma, British and American engineers would throw up Bailey bridges in record time, sometimes building one under enemy fire, piece by piece, while shells exploded overhead. Each one carried not just tanks and trucks, but hope. And yet, even as the Bailey Bridge was proving itself in battles across the world, its true destiny had not yet arrived, because the greatest test of all was still ahead D-Day. By 1944, Allied commanders faced a nightmare of logistics. To land on the beaches of Normandy, they would need to move not only soldiers, but thousands of vehicles, supplies, and reinforcements, all while the enemy's guns tore the coast to pieces. They couldn't rely on French ports. The Germans had fortified or destroyed them. They needed a way to build entire harbors out of thin air floating, temporary, and strong enough to survive the tides. So once again, Britain turned to its builders, its dreamers, and yes, its crazy inventors. Donald Bailey's design became a cornerstone of this effort. His modular bridge system inspired engineers to build floating roadways and piers, creating what became known as the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial ports assembled off the coast of Normandy after D-Day. They looked like science fiction floating causeways stretching across the sea. where trucks, tanks, and troops could land continuously without relying on any existing infrastructure. But none of it would have been possible without Bailey's invention, his simple, genius idea of making strength modular, portable, and universal. Still, even then, Bailey himself remained humble. While generals and commanders took the spotlight, he stayed in the background, continuing to refine his designs and supervise field tests. He never saw himself as a hero, only as a problem solver. But history would disagree. In June 1944, as the first Allied forces stormed ashore at Normandy, Bailey bridges were already being deployed behind the front lines, bridging rivers, craters, and destroyed roads, allowing the relentless flow of men and machines to keep advancing inland. They say the success of an army depends on its supply lines. Without those bridges, D-Day might have turned into disaster. And yet, the strangest part of all is that it began with one man standing alone in the field, testing strange metal shapes, long before anyone cared to listen. He didn't have a laboratory. He didn't have a team. He didn't have a government grant or a title that commanded respect. He just had an idea and the stubbornness to see it through. That's the kind of madness that changes history. But our story doesn't end here. Because what Donald Bailey built would not only change the outcome of the war, it would reshape the very way the world thought about engineering, innovation, and courage under pressure. In the next part, we'll uncover the incredible behind-the-scenes secrets of how his bridges were used during D-Day and the extraordinary moments of bravery from the engineers who risked everything to build them under fire. And we'll reveal how one crazy farmer's invention became the lifeline of the free world. June 6, 1944. Before dawn, the sea boiled with steel. Thousands of ships, from destroyers to landing craft, pushed toward the French coast under a gray, restless sky. The greatest invasion in human history was about to begin. On board those ships were not just soldiers, but engineers, men who carried wrenches instead of rifles, blueprints instead of bayonets. Their mission was simple, yet nearly impossible. Keep the invasion moving, no matter what. And near cargo lay the secret weapon born in a farmer's field, the Bailey Bridge. When the first waves hit the beaches of Normandy, chaos erupted. German guns tore through the air. Smoke choked the horizon. Roads were cratered, bridges blown apart, rivers flooded by retreating enemy forces. Every obstacle was designed to trap the Allied advance on the shore, but the engineers knew what they had to do. As infantry fought for every inch of sand, teams of Royal Engineers and American combat engineers followed behind, dragging Bailey panels through the mud. These weren't soldiers trained for glory. They were builders, carpenters, and mechanics who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. Imagine this: metal beams clanging in the dark, sparks flying as bolts are hammered into place, bullets whistling overhead. They worked under artillery fire, their hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion, from hours of lifting and tightening without rest. Each bridge they built meant another line of tanks could roll forward, another division could cross a river, another town could be liberated. In the days after D-Day, the Bailey Bridge became the beating heart of the Allied advance. Engineers built hundreds of them across France, Belgium, and eventually into Germany itself. Some were small, crossing narrow streams. Others stretched over massive rivers, bridges so long they seemed to defy physics. At one point, near the Seine River, a team of British engineers built a 1,140-foot Bailey Bridge, the longest of its kind in the world at that time. It was completed in just 3 days. 3 days under fire, while the front lines shifted only miles away. Even General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was stunned. He later said that the Bailey Bridge was one of the 3 pieces of equipment that won the war. The other 2 were the landing craft and the jeep. And yet, the man who designed it, Donald Bailey, was still working quietly back in England, improving the system, designing stronger joints, lighter panels, more efficient assembly methods. He never went to the front. He didn't have to. His bridges were already there, carrying history across every battlefield. But what made the Bailey Bridge so extraordinary wasn't just its strength, it was its simplicity. It could be built with no heavy machinery, no cranes, no special materials. Every component was small enough for a handful of men to carry. It could be assembled like a giant meccano set piece by piece, slot by slot, using nothing more than teamwork and determination. In one training manual, it said that a 100-foot bridge could be built in just 36 hours by 40 men. In combat, some unit did it even faster. That's what made it unstoppable. German engineers couldn't believe what they were seeing. They would blow up a bridge one day, only to find the Allies had built a new one overnight. Their defenses, their rivers, their choke points, all useless against the quiet genius of a farmer's invention. The Bailey Bridge didn't just carry tanks, it carried momentum, it carried belief. There are stories from the front, half forgotten now, of soldiers cheering as the first trucks rolled over a new bridge, the ground beneath them trembling not with explosions, but with life. One American engineer wrote in his diary, "We didn't have time to fear. We were too busy building." Every time a bridge went up, it felt like a victory. By late 1944, Bailey bridges were everywhere across the Orne, the Seine, the Rhine. In the final months of the war, they helped connect entire armies, linking supply lines that kept the Allied forces rolling into Germany. But here's something most people don't know. The Bailey Bridge wasn't just used on land. It was adapted for floating structures, creating pontoon versions that could cross wide rivers without permanent supports. Some were even mounted on boats and rafts, forming mobile bridges that could be pushed across by hand or pulled by tugboats. This adaptability made it the most versatile bridge in modern warfare. And yet, the most incredible part of all was how it started from something so small, so personal. Donald Bailey didn't design his bridge with fame in mind. He did it because he believed engineering should serve people, not pride. In interviews after the war, he often said he just wanted to make something useful. That was it. Not glory, not medals, just usefulness. But usefulness has a way of echoing through time. When the war ended, the Bailey Bridge was still being used. In fact, it never stopped. Armies around the world adopted the design. Countries used it for disaster relief, rebuilding, after floods, earthquakes, and wars. Even today, in parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, modernized versions of Bailey bridges still carry trucks and buses over rivers. Think about that. A bridge built from a farmer's sketches in the 1940 seconds, still serving humanity 8 decades later. It's more than an invention. It's a symbol. A symbol of how innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or universities, but from ordinary people who see a problem and refuse to walk away from it. During the war, Bailey was often told his design was too simple to be effective. But simplicity was the secret. While others tried to build perfection, he built practicality. And that's why his bridge endured. You can trace its influence everywhere, from modern modular bridges used by the military to emergency response units that deploy instant crossings after natural disasters. Every time humanity faces an obstacle that must be bridged, quickly Bailey's fingerprints are there. Still, there's something haunting about his story. Because even as the Allies celebrated victory and his invention was hailed as a key to success, Donald Bailey remained mostly unknown to the public. His name didn't appear in the headlines. His face wasn't on posters. There were no parades for him. But among soldiers, among the engineers who watched their bridges rise in the midst of chaos, his name became legend. They called him the quiet savior of D-Day. And perhaps that's fitting because his greatest creation wasn't meant to be seen, but to be crossed. In the next and final part, we'll uncover how Bailey's work reached its most dangerous and inspiring moment, the crossing of the Rhine, and how one man's vision of steel and courage became a monument to human ingenuity that still stands strong to this day. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its furious climax. The Allies had pushed through France, liberated Belgium, and were closing in on Germany itself. But one final terrifying obstacle stood in their way, the Rhine River. The Rhine wasn't just a river, it was a wall, wide, fast, and heavily defended. On the eastern bank, German forces had destroyed every bridge, mined the shores, and waited for the inevitable assault. Crossing it meant the difference between victory and a prolonged war. But to cross it, the Allies would need something extraordinary, and that's when the Bailey Bridge would face its greatest test. The plan was simple in words, but almost impossible in reality. Build a bridge across one of Europe's largest rivers under enemy fire before the Germans could regroup. On the morning of March 24th, 1945, the operation began. As artillery thundered and smoke rolled across the water, teams of engineers moved in, dragging Bailey panels, floating pontoons, and metal decking to the river's edge. They worked with terrifying precision. Every bolt mattered. Every panel had to lock perfectly. There was no room for error, because one mistake meant the entire structure could collapse into the raging current. German shells landed nearby, sending geysers of water into the air. Shrapnel whistled overhead. Men shouted through the smoke, their voices barely heard over the roar of engines and explosions. And yet, they didn't stop. They built through the night, hands numb from cold, uniforms soaked, exhaustion clawing at every muscle. When one team member fell, another took his place. It wasn't about courage anymore. It was survival fueled by purpose. By dawn, the impossible had been achieved. Stretching across the Rhine stood a completed Bailey Bridge, strong, steady, ready. The first tank rolled across it that morning, its treads clanking against the steel plates, and every man watching knew what it meant. The war was crossing its final bridge. Eisenhower later wrote that the success of the Rhine crossing was one of the most decisive moments of the campaign, and at its core stood Bailey's design. One British officer said, "Without that bridge, we might still be on the wrong side of the river." In that moment, what had begun as a farmer's experiment in a quiet English field became a symbol of triumph, proof that ingenuity could defeat even the most fortified barriers of war. But for Donald Bailey himself, there was no grand celebration. While armies advanced, he sat at his desk in London, working on new calculations for future improvements. When he was finally told that his bridge had carried Allied tanks across the Rhine, he reportedly smiled softly and said only 4 words. Good. It did its job. That humility defined him. He never sought recognition, though he received it later: a knighthood from the king, awards from Allied nations, and the undying gratitude of the soldiers who had trusted their lives to his invention. Yet even with honors and medals, Bailey remained the same quiet man, a thinker more interested in ideas than fame. He returned to his rural home, tending his garden, sketching new concepts in notebooks no one would ever read. To the world, the war had ended. To him, creation never did. And maybe that's what makes his story so powerful, because it reminds us that the greatest revolutions don't always begin in boardrooms or laboratories. Sometimes they start in silence, with one person refusing to stop believing that a better way exists. Think about it. A single individual, armed only with imagination, built something that carried entire nations to victory. His bridge didn't just connect 2 sides of a river. It connected courage to opportunity, vision to reality, and humanity to hope. Today, if you travel across Europe or visit military museums, you can still find Bailey bridges, some standing exactly where they were built 80 years ago, still solid, still serving. In remote corners of the world, in flood zones and war-torn regions, engineers still deploy Bailey-style bridges when disaster strikes. They do it because the design still works fast, reliable, unstoppable. And somewhere in that quiet endurance, you can feel the echo of Donald Bailey himself. The world once called him crazy. But the truth is, every great leap in history begins with someone who doesn't mind being misunderstood, because vision always looks like madness to those who can't yet see the outcome. Donald Bailey didn't invent for glory. He invented because he believed that obstacles were meant to be crossed. And that belief, forged in steel and sweat, helped end one of the darkest chapters in human history. So the next time you see a bridge, any bridge, remember this. Behind every span of steel and every arc of concrete lies the spirit of a farmer who refused to give up on an idea. A man who built not just a structure, but a legacy. A legacy that reminds us all The world doesn't change because of titles or ranks. It changes because someone, somewhere, chooses to build.